The 1978 mass suicide at the Jonestown commune was among the most infamous events in cult history. What came after that horrific incident was a nightmare in its own right. What became Pastor Jim Jones's People's Temple commune started as Community Unity Church in Indianapolis in 1954. The group moved to rural California in the mid-1960s before uprooting and settling in Guyana in 1977 on land leased from the Guyanese government. That settlement was officially called the People's Temple Agricultural Project, but was colloquially known as Jonestown. Congressman Leo Ryan was shot to death near the commune on November 18, 1978. Soon after, Jones gathered the members of the commune and told them that it was time to commit what he called revolutionary suicide. Commune members were asked, or perhaps forced, to consume a deadly mixture of sedatives, cyanide, and Flavor Aid, not Kool-Aid as many seem to remember.
They didn't actually drink Kool-Aid. It was cyanide-laced Flavor Aid.
Survivor Odell Rhodes told the Washington Post that infants and young children were given the concoction first. Children represented nearly a third of all the dead at Jonestown. Rhodes himself survived by hiding beneath the building, waiting a few hours, and then walking 5 miles through the jungle to the nearest town. A total of 907 people are reported to have died at the commune from cyanide poisoning. 2 people, Jones and nurse Annie Moore, died from gunshot wounds. Jonestown was populated almost exclusively by Americans, so the U.S. government assumed most of the responsibility for managing the remains. It took 2 days for military aircraft to reach the site and begin transporting bodies. The heat and humidity of the tropical climate meant bodies had entered an advanced stage of decomposition, to the point where transferring them into body bags became a gruesome task. Many service members, as well as others who arrived at the commune in the days after the tragedy, reported that the stench was all but impossible to forget. Back-and-forth exchanges between the U.S. and Guyanese governments added to the delay. Medic Jeff Braley wrote in his recollection of the Jonestown response, The Ghosts of November, that buzzards avoided the mass of bodies. Perhaps, he speculated, the animals understood that the remains were loaded with cyanide and avoided the scene. Though many sources indicate that some portion of the victims at Jonestown drank the cyanide-laced cocktail willingly, Guyanese pathologist Dr. Leslie Mutu and other first responders found evidence to the contrary. In 1978, Mutu told the Chicago Tribune that after personally examining remains on site, he believed most people had been forced into their deaths. The evidence included puncture wounds consistent with hypodermic injections, which Moto believed he had found on at least 70 sets of remains. These marks were reportedly discovered in places that were all but impossible to self-administer, such as the back of an arm or between an individual's shoulder blades. Hypodermic needles were also found scattered at the scene. Author Leslie Wagner Wilson, who escaped Jonestown before the mass suicide, said,
"No, it wasn't all suicide. I've never believed that."
Survivor Odell Rhodes told the Washington Post that he witnessed less than enthusiastic commune members who were pushed to consume the drink by armed guards. Most tragically of all, responders encountered the horrific sight of young children who could not have willingly agreed to participate in Jones's last order. According to Sergeant David B. Netterville, he and other military personnel who initially responded to the scene at Jonestown believed that about 400 individuals had died, with the rest of the commune hiding in the dense jungle nearby. As service members began clearing the remains, they realized that more dead were beneath the first layer. The grim count grew higher by the day. Given that first estimation, many assumed that not everyone had died. Technical Sergeant Wayne Dalton recalled that Jones's cabin contained plans outlining an escape into nearby Venezuela. As a result, helicopters were called in to fly over the proposed route and play commands to presumed fugitives to make their way out of the jungle. Almost no one emerged, and it eventually became clear that nearly everyone at the Jonestown site had died. Faced with a nearly incomprehensible amount of death and the reality of moving seriously decomposed remains in the field, many service members faced trauma that would haunt them for years to come. Some reported trouble sleeping and were particularly disturbed by the sight of many young children who had died. Patricia Edwards, a civilian Air Force employee who managed the details of the recovery efforts, told Time that the logistics of the work could be overwhelming. First, there was the sheer number of dead bodies. Collecting, attempting to identify, and transporting more than 900 bodies from Guyana to the U.S. was a staggering task. They were also in a serious time crunch. Edwards said the cleanup team was only given about a week to clear the site, when 3 weeks would have typically been the standard. To support the mission, the team had to essentially construct a military base on short notice. Professionals had to examine and treat remains, type documents, and process the personnel who moved in and out of the base. Workers also had to provide basic services like regular meals. And of course, someone had to arrange for the many body bags and aluminum containers that acted as caskets. Survivor Odell Rhodes was also escorted back to the site, where he worked with authorities to identify the remains of 183 people he recognized. By the time U.S. military personnel made it to the remote jungle site, some remains were so decomposed that responders had a difficult time keeping them intact while moving them into body bags, much less worry about visually identifying anyone. A small number of individuals, however, were easy to connect to a name. Jim Jones was found where he often was during life at Jonestown, on stage apart from the crowd. Like others, his body had entered an advanced stage of decomposition, but he was otherwise identifiable. Other factors further complicated the process of connecting names to remains. About a third of the dead were children who wouldn't have given clear fingerprints and who would not have had fingerprint records.
Many of the children could not be identified. Other victims went unclaimed.
Meanwhile, identification tags applied at the scene got wet from rain and humidity, making the ink on them all but impossible to read. And because clothing was often shared, name tags found on garments were practically useless. No one was initially sure where the bodies would end up. Originally, there were plans to bury the remains in Guyana, but local officials balked at the idea of having what would surely become a notorious gravesite in their country. Ultimately, officials decided that all remains would be flown to Delaware, which was chosen for its distance from California, where many family members of the deceased live. One official claimed that the physical distance would keep family from flooding the operation and making an already complicated task even more challenging. According to Sergeant David Netterville, remains were first placed in body bags. Then, graves registration personnel from the U.S. Army flew remains into Georgetown, the capital of Guyana, where they were transferred into aluminum containers. From there, they were flown to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware and stored in a hangar. Guyana's chief pathologist, Dr. Leslie Mutu, performed on-site examinations of many of the remains, but full autopsies were not conducted until the bodies were transported to Dover Air Force Base. Only 7 were conducted. 2 individuals were randomly selected, while the families of 4 others requested autopsies. Only one body was specifically singled out to undergo a post-mortem examination, Jim Jones himself. All autopsies took place on December 15, 1978, nearly a month after the deaths, and were conducted by military pathologists. The results were all but useless. Findings confirmed that most had died from ingesting cyanide, though Jones and close associate Annie Moore appeared to have died from gunshot wounds. The advanced decomposition made more detailed examinations difficult. Some remains had been embalmed in an attempt to slow the decay, so some evidence was likely destroyed by embalming chemicals. Some remains may have also been splashed with kerosene in an attempt to eradicate maggots, a move that may have damaged otherwise usable fingerprints. Recovering the bodies of loved ones who died at Jonestown was also quite arduous. As mentioned, there was the distance from Dover Air Force Base from most of the families in California. Families were expected to cover the costs of traveling to Delaware. The military also charged transport fees for remains that came out to almost $500. Moreover, claiming an association with Jonestown and its notorious cultists carried a serious stigma. Some cemeteries feared becoming pilgrimage sites.
Not a single cemetery in the United States wanted the bodies buried there because they were going to have weird cultist rituals.
Because of these barriers, some simply chose to leave the bodies at the local funeral homes where they had been deposited. It was then left up to funeral directors to decide how to dispose of remains, sometimes without any direction from families. The state of Delaware also offered no guidelines for what to do with the bodies. That's likely how the Minas Funeral Home was found in 2014, 2 years after it closed, to be storing the cremated remains of 38 people, including 9 victims from Jonestown. 5 other sets of remains were unlabeled, though investigators doubted they belonged to members of People's Temple. Funeral director Bill Torbert Sr., who oversaw the cremation of Jim Jones and the disposal of his ashes, told Delaware Online that holding on to cremated remains indefinitely was the ethical thing to do, especially if family members showed up decades later seeking to claim the remains. The fact that family members didn't want to claim remains or didn't know that they were there was not, in his opinion, the fault of the owners of Minas Funeral Home. In 1979, 410 unclaimed bodies from Jonestown were buried in a mass grave in Oakland, California. Buck Camphausen, who owned the Evergreen Cemetery that now hosts the mass grave, claimed that he was helping out people who had faced discrimination after they'd been labeled as cult members. After studying how other cemeteries dealt with mass burials, he told a crew to excavate a hill in the cemetery. They placed a large number of burial vaults and caskets into the grave in a stepped pattern. Fieldy McGehee, whose nephew-in-law and 2 sisters-in-law died in Jonestown, told Rolling Stone that there was only a light layer of earth on top of the mass grave, making other burials or a heavy memorial stone ill-advised. As such, marking the gravesite proved to be tricky. In 1979, a San Francisco group known as the Guyana Emergency Relief Committee arranged for a small marker to be placed on the site, but its lack of names proved troublesome for grieving friends and family. 2 more stones were set in place in 2008, but only listed some of the dead. Finally, in 2011, 4 large monuments containing all the names of the dead were unveiled by the Jonestown Memorial Fund. which included one of Jim Jones's surviving sons, Jim Jones Jr., as a committee member.
I wanted to say goodbye, and now I can't.
Some observers were aghast to learn that it was a little too complete. The memorial included a line dedicated to Jones himself. Gynona Norwood, who claimed to have lost more than 20 family members in the Jonestown tragedy, quickly sued. The lawsuit was dismissed in 2014, along with an appeal a year later, and another commemorative stone was erected at the site in 2018. Of the bodies that were claimed by families, most were buried or cremated with little ceremony. Sisters Ann Moore and Caroline Layton were cremated, and their ashes were quietly interred in Davis, California. Layton's son with Jones, Jim John Chemo Prokes, is presumably buried with many other unidentified miners in the mass grave in Oakland. Jones's wife, the long-suffering Marceline, was buried in Richmond, Indiana, alongside her parents, as well as two of her children who also died at Jonestown, Agnes and Lou Eric. Jones himself was perhaps subject to the most hushed end. Torbert Funeral Chapels in Dover was directed by Jones's family to cremate his body and scatter the ashes over the Atlantic Ocean. Funeral director Bill Torbert Sr. told Delaware Online that he and a friend took a small airplane and, once they were about a mile from the coast, simply scattered the ashes into the cold air. For some family members of those who died at Jonestown, the long path the bodies took from the compound in Guyana to graves or family members was agony. Rebecca Moore, sister to Annie Moore and Caroline Layton, wrote that the U.S. government was criminally lackadaisical in its investigation. From her perspective, bodies were treated more as problems than the remains of individuals who required care and justice. She further suggested that perhaps the demographic makeup of the members, many of whom were black and also political leftists with little money or clout, contributed to this neglect. Moore took particular exception with the mishandling of forensic evidence and the scant number of autopsies. Many blamed the Guyanese government for passing on its normal autopsy rules in its haste to rid itself of troublesome corpses. Others pointed to the U.S. government's own haste in the wake of the tragedy, exacerbated by confusion over who exactly was supposed to be in charge of the bodies.